All right, everybody. We are just letting people in and getting started, and we'll be starting momentarily. We have a very large crowd from around the country, and excited for the next hour with you. So as we get started here, as I said, we have people from all over the U.S., and you're here, hopefully, to hear about Emerson, Thoreau, and American Transcendentalism. And for some fun, just put in chat where you're from, just like Vicky did. She's from Richmond. So add where you're from, and if you have a particular interest in this, like what brought you here today? Why did you take an hour out of your day to come here for this? So thank you for doing that. And so I'll start off. I want to thank Beth Williams, the tourist manager for the town of Concord, as she was more than willing to collaborate on our first local history series that AARP Massachusetts has offered. I have a ton of history to draw from here in Massachusetts, so we might be doing lots more of these, especially given the popularity. So I'm Kara Cohen. I'm on the staff of AARP Massachusetts. We have a staff of 10 and then dozens of volunteers that we rely on heavily to get our work done across the state. And as I said, this is a part of a Concord history series. Where we have one more coming up after this. And then you can find other offerings through the AARP Virtual Community Center. That's aarp.org/VCC. And why are we offering something like this? Well, we know that brain health and keeping your mind active is important to you. And another thing that's probably of importance and value to many of you is travel, right? You enjoy travel. So consider visiting Concord, Massachusetts, especially as we approach the 250th anniversary of the American Revolution next year. So for lots of great resources about brain health, you can go to AARP's Brain Health Resource Center at aarp.org/brainhealth. So as you know, we maintain a deep focus on health, financial security, and personal fulfillment for people over 50 and their families. And hopefully you find that reflected in our offerings and resources and in our advocacy. In fact, right now, in every state and all the way to the United States Capitol, AARP is advocating for the issues that affect you most. And we're fighting to protect your hard-earned Medicare and Social Security benefits. And we're urging Congress to lower prescription drug prices, support family caregivers, and stop scams and shut down fraud. AARP is making a difference. We are taking on Big Pharma and winning. Medicare is now able to negotiate for lower prices on some prescription drugs, and insulin copays are capped at $35 a month. We're also fighting any proposed cuts to Social Security, and we know that you've worked hard for retirement. It's your money, and you deserve to keep every cent of it. And we'll keep fighting to protect your interests here in Massachusetts and across the country. So you will want to bookmark the AARP Massachusetts state page. That's aarp.org/MA. That's where we post all of our events, our wins, and our calls to action. And wherever you are, you can find your local state office by going to aarp.org/local. So hopefully this will help you stay informed. As you think of questions you want to ask our speaker today, please place them in the Q&A section, and we will get to as many of them as possible before the hour is up, and we might stay a little bit past the hour if we need to. After today, within 3 business days, the recording will be sent to you. There will also be a brief survey that we hope you will take time to complete. So today's presenter is Richard Picaretto. Richard is a cultural site interpreter for the trustees of reservations at the Old Manse in Concord, Massachusetts, a visitor's guide, tour guide also for the town of Concord, and is the membership and development coordinator for the Thoreau Society. So I think that he has stuffed a lot into this hour, and I will not take up any more time, and I will hand it over to you, Richard, so that you can try to do justice to this amazing topic. And I know that there's probably some people who have special interest in this, and please don't be shy about asking questions at the end of the hour. So without any further ado, over to you, Richard. Take it away.
Thank you, Kara. Thank you very much. From the same ground in Concord, Massachusetts, on which our forefathers fought and died for independence, A wellspring of idealism and self-reflection flowed 2 generations later in a time of relative abundance, technological innovation, and relative peace, the 1830s and 1840s. At the center of what became Concord's idealist solar system was minister, writer, and lecturer Ralph Waldo Emerson, known as the Bard of Concord and the father of American Transcendentalism. If there was a son of American Transcendentalism, it was Henry David Thoreau, 14 years Emerson's junior. Henry moved from being Emerson's protege to being a member of the Emerson household, to ultimately finding a voice of his own as the protagonist of Waldo. American Transcendentalism is amorphous and non-dogmatic. It's considered social, political, and personal all at the same time. It values nonconformity and contradiction. It's not a religion, but many people consider American Transcendentalism religious in nature. Others consider it anti-religious. It continues to be lectured in both public libraries and from church pulpits alike. Nor is American Transcendentalism uniquely American. The works of Emerson and Thoreau took inspiration from both Eastern and Western philosophy and expanded on the classical works of 18th and 19th century German theorists, as well as other thinkers from around the globe from over the centuries. Transcendentalism focuses on the human spirit realizing truth, justice, and beauty first through the intuitive and reasoned mind, and then positing facts. Thoreau writes of building castles in the air and then putting foundations under them. Transcendentalism's emphasis on conversation rests on the Socratic method of dialogue, argument, and inquiry that Emerson, Thoreau, and others in their orbit employed in both private parlors and public lectures alike. If the battle at the North Bridge in 1775 was a battle for America's political independence, Ralph Waldo Emerson's cornerstone text, Nature, written from a room overlooking the bridge in 1834, was a declaration of religious independence. In fact, enough of a paradigm shift that it is referred to as Concord's Second Revolution. On the 25th of May, 1803, as America was looking west and as President Thomas Jefferson was organizing Lewis and Clark's Corps of Discovery, Ralph Waldo Emerson was born in Boston, Massachusetts. His father, a sixth-generation Unitarian minister, served in the pulpit of the First Parish Church, half a block from today's downtown crossing, and the store more recently remembered as Filene's Basement. Emerson was the second of 5 sons who lived to adulthood of William and Ruth Haskins Emerson. Young Ralph became familiar with death and loss firsthand early at age 4 when his brother John Clark died in 1807. 4 years later, Reverend William Emerson himself died of stomach cancer when Ralph was only 8. William's death was devastating to the family. Emerson's mother, Ruth, made ends meet by transitioning the family home into a boarding house. At 9, Ralph was studying at the Boston Latin School, and at home, he and his brothers came under the watchful eye of their indomitable, independent Aunt Mary Moody Emerson. Aunt Mary, his father's sister, was a religious intellectual who played an integral part in Ralph's continued upbringing and education. At 11, Ralph mourned the death of his 3-year-old sister, Mary Caroline. At 14, Ralph started his 4 years at Harvard and decided he would be called Waldo. Suffering from poor health and strained eyesight, Waldo graduated in the middle of his class and served as class poet. He spent his first years out of college teaching at a girls' school in Roxbury outside of Boston. Schoolmaster Hill is named for him in Franklin Park. After returning to Harvard in 1827, Emerson was ordained a Unitarian minister at the Divinity School in 1829, soon to be in the pulpit of the Second Parish Church in what is now Boston's North End. While at work as a traveling minister in Concord, New Hampshire, Waldo fell in love with Ellen Louisa Tucker, she herself suffering more acutely from tuberculosis. Sadly, Ellen died of the disease only 18 months after their wedding at 19 years old. Ellen's death proved another devastating blow to Waldo. He walked miles each day from Boston to Roxbury to visit her grave, where he would sit and read and speak to her spirit. At one point in his journal, he wrote, "I visited Ellen's tomb and opened the coffin." During the time of Ellen's decline, Emerson was feeling more and more disconnected and ambivalent in his role as minister to his congregation. The rote repeat services his congregation expected of him each week left him feeling empty and dismayed. Our worship is dead or dying, our preaching lifeless, he wrote in his journal at the time. Emerson was also deeply engaged in reading Kant and Goethe from Germany, as well as Coleridge, Carlyle, and Wordsworth from the UK. The latest in science presented challenges to historical Christianity. This captivated Waldo, stirring up a crisis of faith he could not subsume. Separating the spectacle from the spiritual in his religious services, Emerson focused on the sacrament of communion, or the Lord's Supper, and notified the leaders of his congregation that he was no longer willing to administer this rite. After months of deliberation, though intent on keeping their beloved minister, the church leaders could not come to a compromise over the impasse. Emerson departed, and his role as a seventh-generation American minister came to an end. Boarding a ship on Christmas Day, 1832, Emerson sailed for Europe to reset and to visit some of those writers that he had been reading. A visit to the Jardin des Plantes, the Paris Plant Museum in 1833, resulted in a moment of profound inspiration, not only taken home to Concord and woven into his first book, Nature, but into all of Emerson's poems, essays, and lectures to come. After seeing a taxonomy exhibit there, demonstrating the relatedness of a variety of plants, Emerson was moved by an overwhelming sense of the holistic continuity between science, man, God, and nature, that nothing is truly separate from anything or anyone else. Upon his return to Concord in 1834-35, Emerson resided with his mother for a time at the Old Manse, home to his step-grandfather, Reverend Ezra Ripley. Sadly, word arrived immediately that Waldo's younger brother, Edward, had died of heart trouble in Puerto Rico. Even from miles away, death was Emerson's constant companion. While at the Old Manse, he began writing Nature. Who looks upon a river in a meditative hour and is not reminded of the flux of all things? Throw a stone into the stream, and the circles that propagate themselves are the beautiful type of all influence. Man is conscious of a universal soul within or behind his individual life, wherein, as in a firmament, the natures of justice, truth, love, freedom arise and shine. This universal soul he calls reason. It is not mine or thine or his, but we are its. We are its property and men. While Waldo was coming into his own with the publication of his first book, another brother, Charles Chauncey Emerson, 5 years Waldo's junior, also died from tuberculosis. Emerson's resilience and propensity for looking forward and not back comes through in Nature. He laments, "Why should we grope among the dry bones of the past or put the living generation into masquerade out of its faded wardrobe? Our age is retrospective. It builds the sepulchres of the fathers. The foregoing generations beheld God and nature face to face. We, through their eyes. Why should not we also enjoy an original relation to the universe? Why should not we have a poetry and philosophy of insight and not of tradition, and a religion by revelation to us and not the history of theirs?" Emerson goes on to share a personal moment of transcendence where he loses himself and finds himself all at once. Crossing a bare common in snow puddles at twilight under a clouded sky, without having in my thoughts any occurrence of special good fortune, I have enjoyed a perfect exhilaration. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed by the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part or particle of God. Emerson experienced what Buddhists call satori, a deep awakening, comprehension, and understanding of one's true nature. David Henry Thoreau was born July 12, 1817. And yes, you heard that correctly, David Henry Thoreau, born at the farm of his maternal grandmother, Mary Dunbar, on the Virginia Road in Concord. He was described as a quiet and observant child, not as outgoing, as his older by 3 years brother John, or by their older by 5 years to Henry, sister Helen. He was nicknamed the Judge as a boy based on his serious and observant qualities. 2 years later, the youngest, Sophia, would be born. Sophia would eventually be Henry's literary executor after his death in 1862. John Thoreau Sr. was a shopkeeper in Concord Center at the time of his second son's birth, walking 2 miles each way daily from the farm to town, but would eventually switch to pencil manufacturing. Thoreau's mother, Cynthia, had a brother, Charles, who lucked upon a vein of graphite called plumbago up in the New Hampshire hills, and after securing it and mining it, collaborated with his brother-in-law, John, on a pencil factory. As the decades of the 1830s opened in Massachusetts, William Lloyd Garrison, a Boston typesetter, began spearheading a movement for the total emancipation of all enslaved individuals in America without compensation to their owners. This economically disruptive, controversial notion found its voice in The Liberator, Garrison's print publication, which soon had the readership of Black readers and women alike. Encouraged by Garrison, the nascent women's movement grew out of the female anti-slavery societies which spread from Boston to Concord to Worcester and Western New York. Garrison's approach was nonviolent and centered on ideas like moral suasion, the idea that America could be guilted or simply shamed into ending slavery, and no governmentism, the idea that our young American government had already grown into the kind of corrupt, immoral, and tyrannical empire that our forefathers went to war against in 1775. A number of women in Concord, like those of the Thoreau household, subscribed to the Liberator and eventually founded the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society in 1837. What at first was a fringe and marginalized group would, 7 years later, become the central fire of the abolitionist and Underground Railroad town that Concord would become. In these years, Emerson found the Boston abolitionists shrill and outspoken, always trying to one-up one another. He wrote in his journal, "Thus you cease to be a man that you may be an abolitionist." David Henry began going by Henry in his teens, and his intellect and temperament made him better suited for Harvard than his brother John. He attended between 1833 and 1837. Upon graduating, Henry refused to pay the $5 fee, $150 in today's money, for his sheepskin Harvard diploma, stating, "Let every sheep keep its own skin." Here. One of the earliest Transcendentalist experiments was undertaken by Bronson Alcott at his Temple School in Boston, a place of progressive early childhood education. With the help of Elizabeth Peabody, known as the mother of American kindergarten, along with the brilliant young scholar Margaret Fuller, Alcott administered a racially integrated school for children, thought by most too young to teach. His unorthodox conversations with children quickly generated controversy, however, and the outcry of local parents led to the school's closure. Its model, however, was picked up in England by educators who had read the 2 books Alcott authored about his experience there and opened their own version of the school in the UK known as Alcott House. (1835 to 1837 were pivotal years for Emerson and Thoreau. In 1835, Ralph Waldo married the pious and intellectual Lydia Jackson of Plymouth, Massachusetts. She and Waldo discovered they shared a deep mutual interest in where human reason met historic Christianity. They were kindred spirits. Emerson nicknamed her Lydian with an N at the end of her name to keep those with a Boston accent from the tendency to call her Lydier. He referred to her as Queenie as well as my Asia. Lydian kept to the more formal Mr. Emerson for her husband, the former minister. Emerson took his public speaking from out of the pulpit and by way of America's new train lines to the stages of the Lyceum lecture circuit. He quickly rose to fame at town, grange, and mechanics halls, participating in a variety of lecture series similar to those of adult education programs today. Waldo purchased the Coolidge House at the corner of the Cambridge Turnpike, known as Bush, today a home museum located across the street from what is now the Concord Museum. Emerson floated the idea of sharing the house with a small community of family and friends, his mother, his brother Charles and his brother's fiancée Elizabeth, as well as Amos Bronson Alcott and his family of little women. Bronson's wife, Abigail, quickly rejected this notion. Emerson's struggle to balance society and solitude was lifelong, and in an 1870 piece, he wrote, "Solitude is impracticable and society fatal. We must keep our head in the one and our hands in the other." Nonetheless, the Emerson household grew rapidly. Brilliant and ambitious 25-year-old Margaret Fuller made her way out to the Emerson house from Cambridge in 1835. The deep friendship that immediately grew between she and Waldo was a complicated and oftentimes frustrating one, platonic yet intellectually intimate at the same time. She stayed for extended periods and became a part of the Emerson household. Waldo and Lydian had a son, Waldo Jr., in 1836, a bright, spirited boy who would be the first of eventually 4 children. Emerson could now afford a cook and a maid to read and write every morning, eat at midday, and then amble extensively each afternoon. He would take friends and acquaintances on multi-mile walks to Walden Pond, where he began to accumulate parcels of woodlots and land, or to what would eventually become Sleepy Hollow Cemetery. 1836 was also the year that one of Emerson's former Harvard classmates, Frederick Henry Hedge, a Unitarian minister and master of German literature and philosophy, while visiting from Bangor, Maine, invited Waldo, George Ripley, and George Putnam to meet at a local hotel. Hedge was intent on starting a discussion group. What grew out of that first meeting would later be dubbed the Transcendentalist Club and lasted for 4 years. It would eventually include Sophia Ripley, Orestes Bronson, Bronson Alcott, Theodore Parker, and a mutual friend of Thoreau's named Charles Stearns Wheeler, among others. At first, it was known as Hedge's Club, and for that reason, some historians point alternatively to Hedge rather than Emerson as the father of American Transcendentalism. At that first meeting, as Laura Dasso-Walls notes in her 2017 Thoreau, A Life, even as the self-congratulations went on at Harvard, 4 of its own graduates were secretly discussing how to unsettle it all and lead America forward to a radically new intellectual life. Emerson found his own wagon hitched to a star after the publication of Nature. The attention it garnered inspired many to meet Emerson in person, and by this time, Bush became a destination for seekers, philosophers, theologians, poets, and eccentrics of all types who made their way to Concord seeking an audience with Waldo. The house became a busy salon. Lydian found herself managing not only her young family's household, but also Hotel Emerson. Emerson was invited to give the Phi Beta Kappa commencement address at his alma mater on August 31st, 1837. Known as the American Scholar, this address echoed his book Nature. It encouraged Harvard's new graduates to look to nature for inspiration, to create their own works rather than to look back across the ocean to Europe, and again asserted that it is one soul that animates all men. Reason is mentioned 5 times in the address. Lastly, in yourself slumbers the whole of reason. It is for you to know all. It is for you to dare all. We will walk on our own feet. We will work with our own hands. We will speak our own minds. Oliver Wendell Holmes called Emerson's lecture America's Intellectual Declaration of Independence. Harvard loved it and invited Emerson to speak again at commencement the next year, 1838. In the weeks before Harvard's graduation speeches and ceremonies, Henry Thoreau left Harvard after his last class and returned to Concord, where he spent some well-earned downtime with fellow graduate Charles Stearns Wheeler at the Wheeler family cabin on the shore of Sandy Pond. Thoreau was kept abreast of the conversations of the Transcendentalist Club through his friend, and while at the cabin, Henry prepared his own remarks for graduation. He was asked to participate in a discussion on the commercial spirit of modern times, which was timely, for America was in the throes of its first major economic crisis. On May 10, 1837, a run on American banks took place due to speculative lending, a drop in cotton prices, and too much commercial paper in circulation. This led to a closure of 40% of America's banks and worldwide deflation and high unemployment from 1837 to 1844. Henry was asked to speak to the moral aspect of America's commercial spirit. Before an assembly of hundreds, he took the position that commerce destroys moral freedom. But freedom must come first, however, because freedom generates commerce, not the other way around. As Wall notes in Thoreau, A Life, Henry emphasized that by tying us to material goods, commerce does not free us, but enslaves us, turns us into brutes. To be human is to cast off these material desires and walk forth freely into paradise. Right there, Thoreau laid the foundations for Walden. Walls goes on to note Henry's suggestion for our standard work week. Work hard enough and be productive enough in one day to be able to take the other 6 days off. Although Henry had taken Emerson's Nature out of Harvard's library twice in 1837, he decided to leave Harvard for home immediately. And after his sober speech on American commercialism, he missed Emerson's Declaration of Intellectual Independence altogether. Good fortune came to Henry amidst the financial panic of 1837, however, a teaching job for the town of Concord. $500 a year pay to teach 90 students. Classes were held on the first floor of the town's Masonic Hall, although he had made it clear to those who'd hired him that he would not engage in corporal punishment. His classroom management was immediately scrutinized by Deacon Nehemiah Ball, who insisted that the use of the ferule, the stick used to hit school children on the open palm, was essential to proper elementary school education. In fact, he required Henry to demonstrate to him and the class the use of the ferule on a boy and girl, each about 10 years old. Henry, totally dismayed, presented his resignation to Nehemiah Ball that evening. Henry's first job out of college lasted 2 weeks. Returning home to work in his father's pencil business, Henry struck up a friendship with a young woman boarding at his family's home with her children, Lucy Jackson Brown, who happened to be the sister-in-law of Ralph Waldo Emerson. Lucy introduced Thoreau to Emerson. Emerson, struck by the spirited intellect of his new friend's wry observations, asked, "What are you doing? Do you keep a journal?" Henry began his journal, which would eventually stretch to over 2 million words. Emerson noted in his journal, "My good Henry Thoreau made else this solitary afternoon sunny with his simplicity and clear perception. Everything that boy says makes merry with society, though nothing can be graver than his meaning." Emerson told more than one visitor that Thoreau was the man of Concord. We could not do without him. In 1838, the Indian removal policy initiated by President Andrew Jackson 8 years earlier was continued under President Martin Van Buren. A letter of protest Emerson wrote to Van Buren made it to the front pages of newspapers across the country. How could we call the conspiracy that should crush these poor Indians our government, or the land that was cursed by their parting and dying imprecations our country anymore? You, sir, will bring down that renowned chair in which you sit into infamy if your seal is set to this instrument of perfidy. And the name of this nation, hitherto the sweet omen of religion and liberty, will stink to the world. Will the American government steal? Will it lie? Will it kill? Such a dereliction of all faith and virtue, such a denial of justice, and such deafness to screams for mercy were never heard of in times of peace and in dealing of a nation with its own allies and wards since the earth was made. Emerson had taken his first public political stance, something he was uncomfortable coming to terms with. Back at Harvard's Divinity School commencement later that summer of 1838, Emerson commented, "Divine nature is attributed to one or two persons and denied to all the rest, and denied with fury." He continued addressing the newly graduated ministers on what he thought were the defects of historical Christianity. This Eastern monarchy of a Christianity, which indolence and fear have built, the friend of man is made the injurer of man, he said. Emerson considered Jesus a son of God rather than the Son of God. He expressed dismay that the Jesus that Jesus had been separated from the rest of mankind and was ordained a king by the church. Emerson continued to lean on reason as well. There is no doctrine of the reason which will bear to be taught by the understanding. The understanding caught this high chant from the poet's lips and said in the next age, "This was Jehovah come down out of heaven. I will kill you if you say he was a man." Faith should blend with the light of rising and of setting suns, he said, with the flying cloud, the singing bird, and the breath of flowers. But now the priest's Sabbath has lost the splendor of nature. It is unlovely. We are glad when it is done. We do make, even sitting in our pews, a far better Sabbath. Whenever the pulpit is usurped by a formalist, then is the worshiper defrauded and disconsolate. We shrink as soon as the prayers begin. And finally, Jesus spoke of miracles, for he felt that man's life was a miracle, and that all that man doth, and he knew that this daily merit shine as the character ascends. But the word miracle, as pronounced by Christian churches, gives a false impression. It is monster. It is not one with the blowing clover and the falling rain. Emerson urged this new flock of ministers to take a new tack and forge a new path through nature to bring their parishioners to divinity with God. He would not be invited back to Harvard for 28 years. In 1838, after a trip to Maine looking for a teaching job in the Bangor area, Henry returned to Concord, where he and his brother John began making plans to open their own school. Tailored to just a few students, it would be run out of where Thoreau's family was currently living, the Parkman House, located where the Concord Free Library stands today. In February 1839, Waldo and Lydia Emerson celebrated the birth of their first daughter, Ellen. By summer 1839, as the Thoreau School was well underway, the Thoreaus received summer visitors, friends from south of Boston. 22-year-old Henry was taken with 11-year-old Edmund Sewell and the, quote, virtue which he is, and would serve as his teacher as well as his summer companion. Hiking, fishing, boating, shooting, and the two got along swimmingly. A stanza of the poem called Sympathy, which Henry wrote for Edmund, reads, "So I was taken unawares by this. I quite forgot my homage to confess. Yet now am forced to know, though hard it is, I might have loved him had I loved him less." Weeks later came the arrival of Edmund's older sister, Ellen, a girl who had summered with the Thoreaus for years but was now a young woman. Ellen had the attention of both Henry and John. The two brothers each courted Ellen on chaperoned excursions. Proposals of marriage from both John and Henry were rejected, however. Ellen's conservative minister father refused to consider either of the Transcendentalist Thoreau brothers as suitable suitors. Laura Dessau-Walls writes that in 1839, Henry Thoreau fell in love twice. On August 31st, 1839, Henry and John navigated a boat they had built themselves up the Concord River north to New Hampshire and back again in 2 weeks. The adventures and diversions along the way would be condensed into a week on the Concord and Merrimack rivers. In it, Thoreau recalls a Sunday hike in New Hampshire and meeting a local minister along the way who chastised him for not being in church, for breaking the Lord's fourth commandment. The minister insisted that men brought disaster on themselves when they missed church. Henry wrote, he really thought that a God was on the watch to trip up those men who followed any secular work on this day and did not see that it was the evil conscience of the workers that did it. The country is full of this superstition, and that the church is the ugliest building in any town because it is the one in which human nature stoops the lowest and is most disgraced. On the displacement of Native Americans, Henry wrote, the white man comes, pale as the dawn, with a load of thought, building a house that endures, a framed house. He buys the Indians' moccasins and baskets, then buys his hunting grounds, and at length forgets where he is buried and plows up his bones. In the fall of 1839, Emerson, Louisa May Alcott's father, Bronson, Margaret Fuller, and George Ripley began work on a literary magazine Emerson had been imagining for years, The Dial. Margaret Fuller would be the editor. The first submission, Thoreau's poem, Sympathy. In 1840, Margaret Fuller worked as editor of The Dial from the Emerson home and an extended stay in the room across from Emerson's study. The Transcendentalist Club ran its course. Discussions of starting a religion split the group between Christians and non-Christians. George Ripley announced that he and his wife Sophia and others would be starting a secular agrarian community called Brook Farm in Roxbury. $500 shares were sold to artists and idealists committed to a communal living experience which provided time to muck stalls as well as time to make art. The idea that a profitable working farm could be sustained by the part-time labors of several artists appealed to many, including the reclusive Nathaniel Hawthorne. By 1841, Emerson's tempest in a teapot, as he called the uproar from his divinity school address, had mostly blown over, but the public was still generally split on Waldo as being either a hero or a heretic. The folks at Brook Farm very much wanted Waldo and his family to relocate there, but with Lydian pregnant again and Emerson's first series of essays on the way, the Emerson house was bustling with activity. Henry Thoreau was invited and accepted to move in with the Emersons as the handyman of the house. Emerson's first series of essays was published at this time, considered by many to be his greatest. His ideas from nature, as well as the Divinity School address, crystallize in Self-Reliance, the second of 12 essays in the book. From Self-Reliance. Trust thyself. Every heart vibrates to that iron string. Accept the place the divine providence has found for you and the society of your contemporaries, the connections of events. Whoso would be a man must be a nonconformist. No law can be sacred to me but that of my nature. Good and bad are but names very readily transferable to this or that. The only right is what is after my constitution, the only wrong what is against it. A foolish consistency is the hobgoblin of little minds, adored by little statesmen and philosophers and divines. Nothing can bring you peace but yourself. Nothing can bring you peace but the triumph of principles. Literary critic Harold Bloom declared Self-Reliance a foundational text in the American literary canon, a powerful vision of spiritual individualism and personal freedom. In November 1841, Lydian gave birth to their second daughter, Edith. In the cold of January 1842, Henry's brother John cut himself while stropping a shaving razor and in a matter of days was convulsing in the throes of tetanus, or lockjaw, as it's known. Henry was absolutely shattered as his older brother died a brutal death in his arms on January 11th. John was 27. 16 days later, on January 27th, young Waldo Emerson succumbed to scarlet fever at the age of 5. None but those who've ever experienced such a loss can fully comprehend the suffering the Emerson family experienced holding little Waldo's lifeless body. Stunned and numbed by the loss, Emerson's poem Threnody is a passionate pouring out of Emerson's grieving soul onto the page. It begins with, "The south wind brings life, sunshine, and desire, and on every mountain meadow breathes aromatic fire. But over the dead he has no power. The lost he cannot restore. And looking over the hills, I mourn the darling who shall not return." Amidst the devastating losses sustained by the Emersons and the Thoreaus in 1842, Bronson Alcott was sent by Emerson to England to meet the administrators of the school in his name. With him on his return trip to Concord was a pair of dedicated and wealthy men intent on establishing a utopian farm community, a farm of philosophy, art, and veganism. This took the form of Fruitlands in Harvard, Massachusetts, detailed in Louisa May Alcott's book, Transcendental Oats. Short-lived and idealistic, it lacked the infrastructure and food supply needed by Alcott, his family, and friends. It failed miserably after 6 months. In 1844, Lydian gave birth to a second son, Edward Waldo Emerson. 1844 also saw Concord's Female Anti-Slavery Society finally sweep Waldo Emerson into their arena in the way that many of its members had long hoped to see. The event celebrating the liberation of the British West Indies 10 years prior had Wendell Phillips and Frederick Douglass speaking in turn with Emerson and Thoreau. The First Parish Church refused to host this controversial gathering. So the event took place at the Concord Townhouse instead. Henry took it upon himself to grab the rope in the church's belfry across the street, however, and ring it himself, its clangs announcing the start of the meeting. With the same sense of holistic unity that inspired him in Paris in 1833, Emerson stated in his speech that day, "The civility of no race can be perfect whilst another race is degraded. It is a doctrine alike of the oldest and of the newest philosophy, that man is one, and that you cannot injure any member without a sympathetic injury to all the members. America is not civil whilst Africa is barbarous." A growing sense of prejudice against the slave states and the expansion of slavery into areas of Indian removal plagued the minds of Thoreau, Emerson, and other Concordians in 1844, while the booming textile mills of Concord, Lowell, and Lawrence were fueled by slave-picked cotton arriving daily. Concord's foremost lawyer, Samuel Hoare, and his daughter Elizabeth returned to Concord after an unsuccessful attempt to defend black sailors in Charleston, South Carolina. They were threatened with violence in the port city and run out of town. Their friends and neighbors in Concord were furious at the way they'd been treated. As Thoreau was honing another of his professional skills at this time, land surveying, he and Edmund Hoare, son of Samuel, accidentally set fire to the local forest and fields. Hundreds of acres were consumed. The campfire they built to cook freshly caught fish was taken by gusts of wind and quickly consumed the woods around them. They sprinted in different directions to summon locals to battle the blaze, but before the fire could be contained by trenches, it burned itself out and the damage was extensive. Henry and Edmund were spared the legal and financial ramifications of the incident through the intervention of Edmund's father, Squire Hoare. Thoreau was derided by his townsmen as woods burner, though remarked in his journal on the renewal he noticed after the accident, giving the destruction, "It was a glorious resurrection from the ashes of the old forest. The greenness has burst forth anew." The Dial magazine also burned out in 1844. It held an important place in getting Transcendentalist writing published, but was more of an acquired taste for readers and received mostly lukewarm and negative reviews from the popular press of the day. During the spring thaw of 1845, Henry Thoreau began work on his 10 by 15-foot house on a plot of Emerson's land at Walden Pond. Emerson himself had envisioned a writing retreat of his own across the pond in what was known as Emerson's Cliff, but this was Henry's experiment. Contrary to what many people have come to believe, Henry was not alone in the wilderness. He had neighbors at Walden Pond, and there are more trees there now than there were then. Much of the area around Henry's corner of the pond was open and recovering from deforestation in 1845. Henry's mind was that of engineer/naturalist, and he began a number of projects simultaneously. A survey of the pond itself and its surrounding flora and fauna, the story of his boat trip with John in 1839, and to explore the spiritual and social impacts of materialism, technology, and an ever more industrialized economy on the autonomy of the individual. "I do not propose to write an ode to dejection," he wrote in the foreword to Walden, "but to brag as lustily as Chanticleer in the morning, standing on his roost, if only to wake my neighbors up." His was not an experiment in isolation or survivalism. The roof raising of his small house was a social event, and he moved constantly between his family home, his new little house, Emerson's, and even ranged as far as Maine while staying at Walden. A meeting of the Concord Female Anti-Slavery Society took place in and around his cabin. Henry was not a hermit. Thoreau left the credit-driven grind of Main Street Concord to step into the marginalized world around Walden. He wrote, "I went to the woods because I wished to live deliberately, to front only the essential facts of life and see if I could not learn what it had to teach, and not, when I came to die, discover that I had not lived." Yes, Henry routinely visited his family to eat pie and get his laundry done. They were just up the new railroad tracks from his new house. He also went to town on errands, as in 1846 to get his boots repaired. Henry was confronted by the sheriff and arrested for not having paid his poll tax, the $1.50 required of voting adults at the time. Henry refused to pay any tax that funded what, in his mind, were the immoral and corrupt actions of a state. The American invasion of Mexico was looming, and the ever more egregious fugitive slave laws made felons of humanitarians assisting those fleeing enslavement. Henry spent a night in jail, and it's presumed one of his aunts bailed him out. The experience led him to write Resistance to Civil Government, which would eventually be shortened to Civil Disobedience. This short text has influenced worldwide social and political movements ever since, those of Gandhi, Martin Luther King Jr., the struggles in Eastern Europe against the Soviet Union. It inspired resistance to the Vietnam War as well. Thoreau asked, "How does it become a man to behave toward this American government today?" I answered that he cannot without disgrace be associated with it. I cannot for an instant recognize that political organization as my government, which is the slave's government also. Unjust laws exist. Shall we be content to obey them? Or shall we endeavor to amend them and obey them until we succeeded? Or shall we transgress them at once? Henry completed most of a week on the Concord and Merrimack, published 1849, while at Walden, and had plenty more material for his masterpiece, Walden, or Life in the Woods, which would be published in 1854. His excursion to Maine during this time yielded more notes and observations for essays on the Maine woods and a trove of meticulous weather data and nature observations used by climate scientists today. Henry wove together his study of economics, taxonomy, demographics, politics, meteorology, history, and spiritual awakening in Walden. In his own moment of satori, while hoeing beans, Thoreau noted, "Sometimes, when I had finished hoeing my beans for the day, I joined myself. It was no longer beans that I hoed, nor I that hoed beans." His friendship with Waldo cooled off a bit by this time, especially after Emerson encouraged Henry to self-publish a week, only to be more publicly critical of it than he was earlier in private. However, Henry did return to live at the Emerson house after leaving Walden. The financial limb that Henry went out on was too long and put Henry in serious debt, with 700 copies of his unsold book returned to him by the publisher. He quipped, "I now have a library of over 900 books, over 700 of which I wrote myself." With time running short and the 1840s just about over, I'm going to add this in conclusion. Henry's stay at Walden ended after 2 years, 2 months, and 2 days in September of 1847. He wrote, "I left the woods for as good a reason as I went there. Perhaps it seemed to me that I had several more lives to live and could not spare any more time for that one." He went on to ardently support John Brown and eulogize him after his execution. He took a trip to Minnesota and is considered the father of the American environmental movement and was one of the first people to propose creating our national parks. Henry's vast catalogs of observations on nature, along with his notes on Native American culture, are still being pored over today by scholars. He eventually returned to live with his family in the busy Thoreau household on Main Street until tuberculosis took him as well in 1862 at 44. After his death, much of his work and his journals were eventually brought to publication by the good work of his sister Sophia, who transcribed and organized what Henry had left. As he lay dying, his Aunt Louise asked him, "Henry, have you made peace with your God?" He replied, "I did not know that we had ever quarreled." Ralph Waldo Emerson continued his rigorous schedule of traveling and public speaking well beyond 1850 and through the Civil War. He would meet Lincoln and travel to Europe, meet naturalist John Muir in Yosemite, and visit San Francisco, as well as Egypt, before his death in 1882 at 78. In the last decades of his life, Emerson suffered from aphasia, and he needed more and more assistance from his wife and his daughter Ellen. Lydian, his wife, lived to be 90 and relayed a sweet story from Emerson's later days. At one point, he asked her, "Who was my best friend?" "Henry Thoreau," she replied. "Yes, Henry Thoreau," he repeated. Thank you for joining us today.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. That was a lot in a short period of time. And so I had to assure people that we are sending out a recording and it'll live on our AARP Massachusetts YouTube page. So just a couple of questions, lots of thank yous. So sort of a funny question is the Thoreau statue life size? Was he really that short?
Oh, he's kind of mid-sized, and I think it's fairly, fairly true to height when you're standing there. The one that's outside his cabin there,
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he might have been 5'7" or something like that, 5'8".
Oh,
He's yeah.
probably
Um,
more the norm for that time anyway.
it's on a block as well, so I guess his height's relative to that as well.
Okay, good. And so another question is, what sites do you recommend visiting in addition to his cabin?
Well, the Concord Museum is incredible. The Old Manse and the National Park, which abuts it, are venerated ground. That is where you have literary and Rev War history combined. The literary history, continues at Orchard House, and occasionally the National Park opens up the Wayside, where Hawthorne wrote, as well as where he also wrote at the Old Manse. Um, there is the Robbins House, the African American History Museum, which is right across the street from the North Bridge battle site. My goodness, yeah, there's a lot in Concord to see for sure.
And beyond nearby. Um, so
Yep.
in answering somebody's question, you can definitely share the recording far and wide. It will be on YouTube, so anybody can watch it. And if you were to, Richard, if you were to try to summarize like the biggest impact of transcendentalism, it's like in a nutshell, like if it was a Wikipedia summary, like transcendentalism, what would be your response?
Uh, I think everybody has sort of a different angle as to what brings them, what piques their interest in transcendentalism. I certainly, that's such a tough question to sort of
Yeah.
summarize in one element. Um, uh, there's a kind of bringing, there's a sort of a bringing yourself to yourself, which I think is important, that a lot of people kind of rely on third parties kind of spiritually and different ideas. And I think that sort of self-redemption is a huge thing that Emerson and Thoreau kind of pointed to, that religion should actually bring you to yourself. And I think for people that come from dogmatic, kind of fundamentalist uh, uh, religious backgrounds, sometimes this can be very freeing to talk about American Transcendentalist thought. I think
Mhm.
that transition there is big one. The connection to nature is fundamental as well. But the women's movement is completely the women. You can't you can't emphasize enough. You could do a whole hour on, and actually we did, didn't we? Victor, my colleague, did a few weeks ago. The women of this town were instrumental in everything. So it's not just these famous men and what they did, and of course, so there's that as well. So it really encompasses all these, from education, the women's movement, civil rights, ideas of true freedom, the idea of how you posit yourself against the state, all these different ideas, which of course, were picked up worldwide, and quite influential. So
Great.
that's a long answer to your two sentence.
No, that's very good.
There's
And
a
then
lot there.
sort of a follow-up is, what was the popular opinion of transcendentalism during their lifetimes from preachers, politicians, and the general public?
Again, that's varied. You're going to have the conservative traditional theologians, absolutely with their hair on fire. And then, but you're going to have Melville, Whitman, Emily Dickinson, the young writers, the young idealists. Whitman mentions, "I was simmering, simmering, simmering. Emerson brought me to a boil." And these people that make their way from, as far away as Virginia. I got to go to Concord. I have to end up at Emerson's house, and Moncure Conway, and this hour has been just the surface level of what's going on here. There's so many other people but they were considered. Transcendentalism was a derogatory term given to them, kind of as a slight. Emerson said that transcendentalism is idealism in 1842. When he was asked about what he thought about it. But he does write his own essay on transcendentalism, and he says we're idealists is what he's saying. So a lot of people laugh at idealists. Get real, So there's that whole contingent as well.
Right. A couple of people mentioned transcendental meditation.
Yes, two different things altogether. I think just the word, um, you know, um, in terms of kind of rising above something. If you're rising above the chatterer in your head, maybe you're saying your mantra and you're in some moments of meditation. The transcendentalists, um, they're they're transcending the idea that nature's our enemy and we have to buffet ourselves against nature, that we actually have to immerse ourselves in nature to actually know our direct connection to God, because God is nature and is a part of us physically. We're transcending the idea that life happens to us. There's so much about the transcendentalists that are like, yeah, there's a bunch of things like Emerson, how many deaths and so much tragedy, and this guy absolutely thrives. He just keeps going. Any one of those deaths would have taken any one of us out, and in deep depression and all kinds of problems. And this guy, you're transcending the loss that is part of life. You're transcending this idea that life just happens to you. This group of writers is about manifesting. This is about going, and there's a whole half of your life that absolutely happens based on what you do and what you put into it. And that's very inspiring also. So there's a lot of different things being transcended as well.
I love it. This is great. So I think you have a couple of thank yous to close out here.
Thanks to everybody. I see we have some pretty good numbers of folks from all over. And yeah, come visit us in Concord. I hope to meet you. Come introduce yourself if you saw this online.
Yes, and it will live in perpetuity on YouTube, as well as our past webinars. So please
Oh,
check it
I did
out.
want to, yeah, I did want to throw a quick thank you in to you, Kara, and to Beth Williams, as you had mentioned, from Concord Visitor Center. I also want to thank the Special Collections Department at the Concord Free Library, who allowed me to use a number of images that I use today. They're always great. Thank you.
Fabulous. So we do have one more question that was asked. How was what he wrote on commercialism reconciled with his seemingly comfortable way of life? I love ending with a slightly controversial question.
Henry, in terms of Well, Henry is not non-commercial. Don't forget, he's in the pencil business with his father. And what I did not talk about is how um, absolutely innovative Henry was in the pencil business. Henry is both this naturalist and idealist, but he's an engineer, and he loves the way things work. He comes up with these different grades of pencil. He comes up with new ways of mixing clay with the plumbago, the graphite, and making these pencils for his father's company, for his family's company. And so he is not a Luddite. He's not non-commercial. He is just warning us to uh, be very wary of materialism because we will lose our life constantly scrambling to keep up with all the debt that we've taken on and for all the material things we need. And so a lot of Walden, Henry starts out obnoxiously in Walden with economy, where he brags about the nails costing 7 cents, but they really should have cost 4. And it's really pecuniary. And you say, why is he being so obnoxious? Then you finally realize Henry's holding a mirror up to us. We're the ones obsessed with money. And Henry is pointing out, Ralph Waldo's house was $3,500. His house is $26 and some cents or something like that. And so the whole money thing, Henry is telling us just to be very careful with. He's not sort of on one side totally or the other. He's just saying be careful about materialism. It'll take our lives from us.
Yep, as somebody said, what great foresight there. And somebody did have one more question about Thoreau's book Cape Cod. They rarely see it mentioned, so they were wondering.
That's true. Yeah, he did take his walk down through Cape Cod and write about that. He writes about Maine and as well. Yeah, I just didn't have time to fit this in. I actually had to pull a lot of stuff out of what I put into this presentation when I saw that it was butting right up against an hour. I wanted to try and keep some continuum of some of the people that I was mentioning in particular, but there's so much going on here.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Well, hopefully you did justice to it, and so we know we'll keep this up on our website, on YouTube, and Richard, you can share with your peers and with folks around Concord. There's a strong community of local historians that you're part of, and this is kind of like a second or third chapter in your life, which perhaps some of our listeners today are considering this as well. So you're enjoying this new chapter in your life as well, Richard.
yeah,
You
yeah.
weren't always a local historian, right?
Well, I was not always. No, no, no. No, I've been for just the last 3 or 4 years now.
Amazing.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. No, follow your bliss.
Yes, follow your bliss.
That's
And
what
on
the
that
COVID
note,
times. Yeah,
yeah.
after COVID, it was like, wait a minute. Okay, do what you really want to do. Life's short. Do what you want to do. Do what you're passionate about. Do what interests you. Go do it.
Great. So a couple of people are saying, how about a part two? Have Richard back. So
Yeah,
we love how you ended this. Great sentiments. Thank you so much, Richard. And everyone, look for the email that we'll send out by Friday, along with the recording and the survey for your feedback. So thanks so much, Richard, especially for the message that you ended on. And cheers to everybody.
all right. Thanks, everybody.